Star Wars is an interesting franchise, as there is a pretty sizable gap in time between the making of each trilogy of films, but as of late we've been getting more Star Wars content than ever. When The Force Awakens dropped in 2015, it was our first taste of live-action Star Wars in a decade, and fans were hungry for more. Fan theories were at an all-time high, as everyone had a theory on who Rey was related to, who Snoke was, and why Luke was in exile. But we then proceeded to get a Star Wars film every year from 2015 to 2019. Rogue One in 16, Last Jedi in 17, Solo in 18, and Rise of Skywalker in 19. And I think that was just too much Star Wars on the big screen. Star Wars is a vast franchise with a lot of potential stories to be told, but a film every year is just not the status quo for Star Wars, as it worked to make each film feel less special in my opinion. I know Marvel worked for many years with a multiple film per year system for Disney, but what works for one franchise doesn't necessarily work for another. So with The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker being panned by many critics and hated by a lot of fans, and Solo being a box office bomb, Star Wars under the Disney regime needed a spark to reignite itself, and The Mandalorian was exactly what it needed. The Mandalorian is essentially a serialized western with a somewhat mysterious but cool lead, and this sort of self-contained, smaller-scale story is exactly what the Doctor ordered. I think part of what made the last three films in the Disney Star Wars run feel so unsatisfying is that the end goal or overall purpose of the films was a bit unclear, but I've already critiqued these three films enough in previous videos, so if you'd like to know my thoughts on those films in more detail, check out my Star Wars playlist of videos. And the important point is that The Mandalorian Season 1 and 2 are very focused on building the bond between Grogu and Mando. In protecting Grogu or getting him to a Force user or someone of his kind is the end goal. Because this is the clear end goal of these first two seasons, it allows for side quests, other Star Wars character cameos, and effective lore building. That builds intrigue into other characters and creates interesting directions for other shows or movies to explore. Now, regardless of how successful or good these spin-offs ended up being, The Mandalorian did do a good job to build the intrigue for them in the first place, as characters such as Boba Fett, Ahsoka Tano, and Bo-Katan seamlessly fit into the narrative without overtaking the objective of the show. Like the action scene where Boba Fett takes out a bunch of stormtroopers single-handedly was so badass, and the coolest that character has ever been in my opinion. As touched upon briefly, the mysterious nature of both Mando and Grogu also aids in building fan engagement in the show. With Grogu, he's of the same species as Yoda and Yaddle, was a youngling, but can't talk yet, which means that finding out details about him naturally happens slowly over the course of the first two seasons, which makes him an interesting character that we just want to know more about, on top of him being absolutely adorable. Mando is similar in the sense that he is from a fractured group of people who had their planet raided and essentially destroyed by the Empire, meaning that he is a rarity for the time period and certainly had a rough and interesting road to where he is now. So very much like with Grogu, we as fans are naturally going to want to know more about him and stick around for explorations of his backstory. His Mandalorian suit is also just badass, and the fact that he wears his helmet at all times makes the very few times he actually takes it off really meaningful. And if you didn't at least come close to shedding a few tears when Din Djarin and Grogu had their goodbye at the end of Season 2, you need to check your pulse, because you may very well be heartless. One of my favorite aspects of Mando as a character is actually the fact that he's very much not invincible. In fact, he kind of gets tossed around and roughed up quite a bit throughout the series, which helps to add stakes to the action scenes, but also helps make Mando a more likable character as he comes off as a bit of an underdog just trying to make his way in the galaxy. And it's easy to root for characters who experience setbacks but persevere nonetheless. This is something that the sequel trilogy just kind of missed the mark on completely, as Rey didn't really face any extreme adversity throughout the trilogy and is kind of overpowered off rip, as she defeats Kylo in a duel her very first time ever wielding a lightsaber, whereas Mando isn't related to someone powerful, doesn't have force powers, and while he does briefly have the Darksaber, typically is just a blaster kind of guy. Mandalorians in general also have a deep and interesting lore that has only been explored in animation through the Clone Wars and Rebel shows, so getting to see Mandalorians in live action is pretty cool and created the potential for animation characters to be seen in live action for the first time. Now, throughout this video, you've probably noticed that I've repeatedly said Seasons 1 and 2 over and over again, and this has been very intentional as Season 3 doesn't really work for me for a few reasons. As touched upon earlier, the bond between Grogu and Mando is the driving force of the show, as their slightly improbable father-son-like connection is emotionally engaging, and Season 2 was a perfect culmination of that, as Din Djarin finally got Grogu to a Force user and removed his helmet so Grogu could see his face. Now, reuniting the two isn't the worst idea, even if it does undercut the emotional moment from the Season 2 finale a bit, but the reunion should have by no means taken place during the Book of Boba Fett. I know all of the series within the Mandoverse are all interconnected, but this is a key moment that should have been built up to through Season 3 of The Mandalorian. And just as Disney oversaturated the market for their Star Wars films, they made the same mistake with their television series on Disney+. We got Mandalorian Season 1 in 2019, Mandalorian Season 2 in 2020, Book of Boba Fett in 2021, Obi-Wan Kenobi in 2022, Andor also in 2022, Mandalorian Season 3 in 2023, and Ahsoka in 2023, and with a few more series on the way. And I think it is plain to see that the rush to release series at this fast of a pace is not to tell their stories in the best and most effective way possible, but to just maintain Disney Plus subscriptions, and as a fan, this is just disappointing. As I've wanted to know what Kenobi was up to on Tatooine for all those years for most of my life, but now that we have the show, I wish it was still a mystery because that show just was not it. All in all, The Mandalorian is a very unique Star Wars project that provided a much-needed spark to the Disney Star Wars regime, as its setting, lead characters, and action all felt very fresh and different to what the previous Disney Star Wars content looked like, with Mando essentially being an armored, futurized version of a Western film lead. The show just made it feel cool to watch Star Wars and root for a character again. Now, I do think Disney has kind of ruined this feeling a bit with their oversaturation of Star Wars Disney Plus content, but the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian were great and arguably the best content that the Disney Star Wars era has to offer. If you enjoyed this analysis of The Mandalorian or are interested in further explorations of screen stories, please feel free to drop a like and subscribe, and if you agree or disagree with my takes, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.